The storm clouds loomed heavily over the fjords, casting a cold shadow on the rugged landscape below. The air was thick with the scent of salt and wet earth, the only sounds being the roar of crashing waves and the distant cries of gulls. Along the craggy coastline a lone figure stood tall, draped in a dark fur cloak, her eyes fixed on the horizon. Freydis, daughter of the fallen chieftain, felt the weight of her father's death more with each passing day. The winds carried whispers of an unknown enemy, one that had slaughtered her people and taken what was rightfully hers. She clenched her fist around the hilt of her sword, its metal gleaming in the fading light. "This is not over," she whispered to herself, her breath a plume of mist in the cold air. As the first hint of night began to settle, Freydis steeled herself. The battle would soon begin, and she would lead the charge. Her father's legacy was not a thing to be erased by time or blood. As Freydis turned from the cliffside, her gaze hardened with a quiet fury. She could almost hear the voices of her fallen kin, calling her to avenge them. Their spirits whispered on the wind, urging her forward. With a final glance at the darkening sky, she moved down the rugged path, her footsteps sure and steady. The ground beneath her was treacherous, but she paid no mind to the danger. The call for retribution burned in her chest. Her father's death had been no accident. It had been orchestrated by the unseen enemy that now threatened her homeland. "I will find them," Freydis swore, "and they will pay." The promise was as cold as the wind that cut across her face, but there was something else in her voice, resolve and a hunger for justice that would not be easily quenched. The path ahead twisted into a dense forest, the tall pines standing like silent sentinels against the darkening sky. As Freydis entered the forest, the atmosphere shifted, the heavy silence pressing in on her. The only sound was the occasional rustle of leaves and the soft thud of her boots on the forest floor. She could sense movement in the trees, a flicker of shadows. She was not alone. Her hand instinctively went to the dagger at her belt, the cold metal offering a semblance of comfort. The stories of beasts that roamed the forest whispered in her ears. But she knew it was not the animals that she needed to fear. It was the enemy who had taken everything from her, and they would find no mercy in her. Freydis' senses were heightened as she pressed deeper into the woods. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves, put her on edge. The wind shifted, carrying a scent she could not place. It was a faint, metallic odor, mingled with the familiar musk of wet earth. She stopped, her eyes darting around as she crouched low to the ground. Her instinct screamed that she was being hunted. A shadow moved between the trees, too quick for her to catch a clear glimpse. She stood slowly, the dagger now gripped firmly in her hand. Her breath was shallow as she listened intently. The enemy was close. "I know you're there," she muttered under her breath, her voice steady but laced with the tension of the moment. Suddenly, from the shadows, a figure emerged, tall, cloaked in black, with eyes that glowed faintly in the dark. Freydis tensed, her muscles coiling like a spring, ready to strike. But the figure made no move toward her. Instead it spoke, its voice low and menacing. "You should not have come here, Freydis." Her blood ran cold at the mention of her name. She had heard tales of this shadowy figure, the assassin who had brought ruin to her village, the one who carried out the orders of the unseen enemy. "I come for what is mine," she replied, her voice fierce. "And you will pay for what you've taken." The figure smiled darkly, the air thick with malice. The first true battle was about to begin. The forest grew darker as the hours stretched on. Freydis moved swiftly, her every step guided by instinct rather than sight. Her mind raced with thoughts of vengeance and justice, but there was a growing sense of unease that gnawed at her. The deeper she ventured, the more she felt the weight of the silence that enveloped the forest. The trees seemed to close in around her, their twisted branches reaching out like skeletal hands. She paused, crouching low once more, and listened intently. Something was wrong. The air was thick with a heavy stillness, an unnatural calm that made the hairs on the back of her neck stand on end. Her grip tightened around her dagger as she took another cautious step forward. Then a distant rustle broke the silence. It was not the wind. Someone, or something, was following her. Her pulse quickened as the realization sank in. She was no longer alone in the forest. "Show yourself," she called, her voice steady, but inside the tension was unbearable. She was ready, but was the enemy as well. From the shadows of the trees, a pair of glowing eyes suddenly gleamed in the darkness. Freda's heart skipped a beat, but she remained still, her focus razor sharp. The eyes were followed by the creak of leather and the faint rustle of metal. Someone was indeed there. The figure stepped forward, emerging from the gloom, with an eerie silence that seemed unnatural. Clad in dark armor and a tattered cloak, the figure moved like a predator, each movement calculated, precise. The glow from the eyes became clearer, revealing a mask of pale, emotionless features. An assassin. Freydis took a slow breath and rose to her full height, her dagger held at the ready. "You won't find me an easy target," she said, her voice cold and full of challenge. The assassin did not respond at first, but instead took a few measured steps toward her, their movements slow and deliberate. A grin, faint but sinister, appeared behind the mask. "We will see," the assassin replied, their voice like gravel scraping against stone. The forest held its breath. Freda's grip tightened on the dagger, the blade gleaming with a deadly promise. The assassin's cold eyes locked onto hers, and in that moment she felt the weight of their presence, a predator sizing up its prey. The air between them crackled with tension. Every muscle in her body was coiled, ready to strike. Without a word, the assassin lunged, moving with the speed and precision of a serpent. Freydis barely had time to react, but her instincts kicked in. She sidestepped just in time, the assassin's blade swishing through the air where she had stood a moment before. A clash of steel rang out as she swung her dagger at the assassin's exposed side. The assassin parried with ease, their eyes gleaming with cruel amusement. "You're swift, but not swift enough," the assassin taunted, their voice dripping with mockery. Freydis gritted her teeth. She knew she had to be faster. There was no room for hesitation. The battle was not just for her life. It was for the legacy of her people. The battle raged on, each strike echoing through the stillness of the forest. Sweat trickled down Freda's face, her breath coming in short gasps, but she did not falter. Every movement was calculated, a dance of life and death that played out beneath the canopy of ancient trees. The assassin's movements were relentless, fast and precise, but Freydis' resolve was stronger. With a swift twist, she managed to disarm the assassin, sending their blades skittering across the forest floor. The assassin's eyes flashed with fury, but Freydis didn't hesitate. She advanced, pressing the point of her dagger to the assassin's throat. "You've lost," Freydis said, her voice low and unwavering. The assassin glared up at her, but there was no fear in their eyes. Instead, they smirked, a twisted grin that sent a shiver down Freydis' spine. "The war is just beginning," the assassin whispered, and in the blink of an eye, they vanished into the shadows, leaving only the rustle of leaves in their wake. Freydis stood, panting, the weight of the encounter heavy on her shoulders. The assassin was gone, but their words lingered like a curse on the air. Freydis stood motionless in the eerie quiet that followed the assassin's disappearance. Her chest heaved, her breath coming in quick, sharp bursts. The words the assassin had left her with echoed in her mind, a chilling reminder that this encounter was merely a fraction of the war that loomed ahead. The war is just beginning. What did it mean? Who were they working for, and what did they want from her? These questions gnawed at her as she wiped the sweat from her brow. But as much as her mind raced, her resolve remained unwavering. She could not afford to be distracted by uncertainty. With a final glance at the now empty forest, Freydis turned away, her steps echoing in the quiet. The journey ahead would be perilous, but it was the only path to justice for her people. And there would be no turning back. She had to find answers, no matter where they led. As she made her way deeper into the forest, a figure watching from afar stirred in the shadows. Freydis would soon learn that every step she took now was part of a much larger game. The forest eventually gave way to a wide valley, a place untouched by the chaos of war. A serene river wound its way through the valley, the water clear and cold, reflecting the stark beauty of the surrounding mountains. But even here, The shadows of her father's death loomed large. Freydis paused at the river's edge, her reflection rippling in the water as the current flowed past. She had been traveling for days now, following the faintest whispers of information, hoping to find someone, anyone, who could provide answers. The assassin's words lingered in her mind like a curse. Who had they been working for? And why had they sought her out specifically? As she knelt by the river, dipping her fingers into the cold water, a figure appeared on the horizon, silhouetted against the rising sun. Freydis stood, the hairs on the back of her neck prickling. She wasn't alone anymore. Someone was approaching, and they didn't look friendly. The figure grew closer, revealing a tall, broad-shouldered man, his features roughened by years of hardship. His face was marked with the scars of battle, and his eyes, dark and intense, locked onto Freydis as he approached. He was armed, an axe hanging from his belt, and a sword sheathed at his side. There was something about him, a quiet, dangerous energy that made Freydis instinctively reach for her dagger. But instead of attacking, the man stopped a few paces from her, his gaze softening as he spoke. "I've been waiting for you, Freydis," he said in a deep voice that carried a weight of authority. "Your reputation precedes you." Freydis eyed him warily, her hand still on her dagger. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice cold and guarded. The man smiled faintly. "A friend, or perhaps an ally. The choice is yours." His words hung in the air, and Freydis felt an odd mix of curiosity and suspicion stir within her. Freydis studied the man closely, her eyes narrowing as she weighed her options. He didn't appear to be a threat, at least not immediately, but she had learned long ago not to trust appearances. The world was full of false allies and hidden enemies. Still, there was something about this man that felt different. "What do you want from me?" she asked, her voice steady despite the uncertainty creeping into her heart. The man's smile faded, and he stepped forward, his gaze locking onto hers with an intensity that made her pulse quicken. "I know who killed your father," he said, his words blunt, but not without a trace of sympathy. Freydis froze, her breath catching in her throat. She hadn't expected this, not like this. The world seemed to stop around her. "Who?" she demanded, her voice low and dangerous. The man hesitated for only a moment before replying, "I can take you to them, but it won't be easy. They're not just enemies of your family. They've been hunting you for years." Freydis' heart pounded in her chest. She had finally found the lead she had been searching for, but it came with a price. Freydis took a step back, her mind racing. The revelation struck her like a thunderclap, leaving her momentarily stunned. For years she had been searching for answers, for any sign of the enemy that had destroyed her family. And now, this man claimed to know the truth. "Who are you really?" she asked, her voice laced with suspicion. The man's expression softened, and he lowered his axe slightly, as if trying to reassure her. "I am someone who lost everything too," he said quietly. "I know what it's like to be hunted, to feel the weight of revenge on your shoulders. But I also know that we can't do it alone." Freydis didn't know whether to trust him, but something in his voice told her he wasn't lying. There was a shared pain between them, something she couldn't ignore. "What's your name?" she asked. The man looked at her for a long moment before replying, "Hakon, and I think we have a common enemy." Freydis studied him for a moment longer, then nodded. "Hakon," she repeated, testing the name on her tongue. She had made her decision. "I'm listening." As Freydis and Hakon began to make their way through the valley, the tension from their earlier encounter seemed to fade, though the unspoken bond between them remained. Their conversation was sparse, but it didn't need to be filled with words. They both understood the gravity of their quest. The world around them felt different now, as if the journey had truly begun. For the first time in days, Freydis allowed herself a moment to breathe. The weight of her father's death and the haunting unknowns lightened, if only for a moment. Hakon had said he knew the enemy, but that didn't mean their path would be easy. They would face more trials, more enemies, and perhaps even their own doubts along the way. But Freydis was ready. She had to be. Her father's memory, her people's legacy, was with her every step of the way. As the sun dipped lower, casting the valley in a golden hue, Freydis turned to Hakon. "Let's go," she said, her voice filled with determination. "The real fight is just beginning." The journey through the valley soon gave way to a dense and ancient forest, where the trees towered over them like silent sentinels, their twisted branches blocking out most of the light. The air grew thick with the scent of moss and damp earth, and the only sounds were the crunch of leaves underfoot and the occasional bird call. Freydis and Hakon had been traveling for days now, their path taking them deeper into unfamiliar territory. Tensions remained high, but the bond between them had strengthened. They shared little, but their silent understanding spoke volumes. "We're getting closer," Hakon said suddenly, his voice low and steady. "They're not far." Freydis nodded, but said nothing. She could feel it too, the undeniable pull of destiny, drawing her toward something unknown, something terrifying. The wind rustled through the trees, carrying with it a sense of foreboding. "Stay alert," she said, her voice quiet but firm. She had learned long ago that in places like this, danger was always just beyond the shadows. The deeper they moved into the forest, the more oppressive the atmosphere became. The silence was thick, almost unnatural, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. Freydis couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, that unseen eyes were tracking their every move. She gripped her dagger tighter, her senses heightened. Then from the silence came a low growl, too deep, too guttural to belong to any ordinary creature. Freydis froze, her muscles tense. Hakon raised his hand, signaling for her to stay quiet. They both stood motionless, listening to the sound, which grew louder, closer. Suddenly, from the underbrush, a massive shape emerged, a hulking creature with glowing eyes and a mouth full of sharp, jagged teeth. It was unlike anything Freydis had seen before, a twisted hybrid of man and beast. The creature snarled, its breath hot and heavy, as it lunged toward them. "Get ready," Hakon shouted, drawing his axe. The creature's eyes locked onto Freydis, and with a deafening roar, it charged toward her. Freydis sprang into action, rolling to the side as the creature's claws swiped through the air where she had been standing. She quickly regained her footing and launched herself at the beast, aiming for its exposed side. Hakon, meanwhile, circled around, trying to get behind it. The creature roared again, swiping its massive claws, forcing Freydis to retreat just out of reach. "Watch out," Hakon shouted, as he swung his axe toward the creature's leg, but it was quick and managed to dodge. Freydis was breathing hard now, her muscles burning from the fight. She had underestimated the creature's speed. "We need to work together," she said through gritted teeth. Hakon nodded without a word, his focus locked onto the beast. They had no choice but to rely on each other if they were going to survive this. The battle raged on, and Freydis felt the strain of the fight settling deep into her bones. But there was no time for fatigue, no time for doubt. The creature was relentless, its claws and teeth vicious, its speed unnerving. But Freydis was quicker. She ducked under its swipe and stabbed her dagger into its side, a deep, satisfying thrust. The creature howled in pain, staggering back, giving Freydis and Hakon a moment to regroup. "We have to end this now," Hakon yelled, his voice urgent. Freydis nodded, blood pounding in her ears as she rushed forward. She moved with purpose, each step calculated. She dove beneath the creature's outstretched claws, coming up on its other side, where Hakon was already waiting. With one synchronized motion, they both struck. Freydis plunged her dagger into the beast's throat, while Hakon swung his axe down hard on its skull. With a final, agonized roar, the creature fell, its massive form crumpling to the forest floor. The two stood over it, breathing heavily, the silence of the forest returning as the battle ended. As the last of the creature's life faded, Freydis wiped the blood from her dagger, her eyes still locked on the lifeless form of the beast. Hakon let out a long breath, lowering his axe and sheathing it. "We were lucky," he muttered. Freydis didn't respond immediately. She was too focused on the task ahead, the journey that still lay before them. "It's not over," she said quietly, almost to herself. "We have a long way to go." The reality of their situation settled in once more. They had survived this encounter, but it was only one of many that awaited them. The path would only grow darker from here. But Freydis was ready. They had to keep moving, keep pushing forward. "Come on," she said, her voice filled with resolve. "Let's go. The enemy won't wait for us." Hakon nodded, his eyes hardening with a silent promise. Together, they turned and moved deeper into the forest, the sound of their footsteps muffled by the thick foliage. The journey ahead was uncertain, but Freydis knew one thing for sure: she wouldn't stop until she had her answers. The forest eventually gave way to open land, where the terrain became harsher, and the winds colder. Freydis and Hakon had traveled for hours without speaking much, each lost in their thoughts, their steps determined but weary. The sun had begun to dip low, casting long shadows over the barren plains. They had heard no more signs of creatures lurking in the shadows, but Freydis knew better than to trust silence in places like this. It was too easy to forget danger when the world seemed calm. Hakon stopped suddenly, his gaze fixed on something far ahead. Freydis followed his stare, her eyes narrowing. In the distance, a dark shape loomed, a fortress of stone and iron perched on a jagged cliff. It was unmistakable. "That's where they're hiding," Hakon said, his voice low but sure. "The ones responsible for your father's death." Freydis felt a chill run down her spine. The fortress was imposing, but it was nothing compared to the vengeance burning in her heart. "We need to get closer," she said, her tone steely. "Tonight, Dot." As they approached the fortress, the terrain became increasingly difficult to navigate, the rocky landscape making each step more treacherous. They moved carefully, using the shadows of the twilight to their advantage. The closer they got, the more Freydis could feel the weight of the place pressing down on her. This was it, the heart of the enemy's power. This was where the answers she sought would finally be revealed. Hakon was ahead of her, his movements swift and quiet, as he guided their path along a narrow trail that wound up the side of the cliff. The fortress loomed above them, its dark silhouette like a shadow against the evening sky. "We'll have to be careful," Hakon muttered, glancing back at her. "The guards here won't be forgiving." Freydis nodded, her hand gripping her dagger tightly. "I don't plan to be caught." Every instinct told her to charge forward, to confront whatever awaited inside the fortress, but she knew better. She needed to approach this with strategy, not haste. They reached the base of the fortress as night fully settled in, the world around them cloaked in darkness. The air was colder now, carrying with it the scent of damp stone and the faint echo of distant unseen movement. The fortress was even more intimidating up close, its towering stone walls reaching into the sky like the claws of some ancient beast. There were no visible guards, no lights from within, just the looming darkness. Freydis could feel her heartbeat quicken. This was the moment of truth. They had come so far, and now there was nothing left but to move forward. "We need to find a way inside," she whispered, her voice steady. "There has to be an entrance." Hakon nodded, scanning the walls. "There's a hidden passage," he said after a moment, his voice low. "But it's on the other side of the fortress. We'll need to circle around." Without a word, they turned and began to move, their steps quick and silent as they navigated the perimeter of the fortress, staying in the shadows to avoid detection. As they circled the fortress, the shadows seemed to grow thicker, the night more oppressive. Every creak of the stone beneath their feet felt like an alarm, every rustle of the wind, a warning. Freydis stayed close to Hakon, her senses heightened. The passage Hakon spoke of was just ahead, but something didn't sit right with her. She could feel it in the pit of her stomach, a presence, a subtle shift in the air. "We're not alone," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Hakon paused, his eyes scanning the darkness. "Stay close," he said, his voice a low growl. They moved slowly now, their steps more cautious. It wasn't long before they reached a hidden entrance, a small door tucked into the stonework. But just as Hakon reached for the handle, a figure appeared from the shadows, an assassin, cloaked in black, his eyes glinting with malice. "I knew you would come," the assassin said, his voice cold as ice. "But you're too late." The assassin moved swiftly, his silhouette a blur against the dark backdrop of the fortress. Freydis was already in motion, her dagger drawn and ready. She met the assassin's blade with a sharp, ringing clash, their weapons locking for a brief moment. The assassin grinned, his eyes filled with sadistic pleasure. "You're more skilled than I expected," he said, pushing against her dagger with surprising strength. Freydis snarled, pushing back with all her might. Hakon moved to her side, his axe raised to strike, but the assassin dodged, flipping backward with an agility that defied logic. "You're playing right into their hands," the assassin taunted, his voice echoing in the silence. Freydis' heart raced, but she refused to back down. "I'll stop you," she said, her voice fierce. "And I'll stop whoever you're working for." The assassin's smirk faded, replaced by a dangerous glint in his eyes. "We'll see," he whispered, lunging at her once again. The battle was on. The assassin's blade moved with a terrifying precision, each strike aimed with deadly intent. Freydis danced around him, her dagger flashing in the dim light of the hidden passage. Every movement felt like a test, pushing her to the limits of her strength and agility. Hakon swung his axe, but the assassin was too quick, dodging with ease and taunting them both with his maddening grin. "You think you can stop what's coming?" the assassin sneered, his voice dripping with venom. Freydis' pulse raced as she parried another strike, her arm aching with the effort. "I'll stop you," she growled, her eyes burning with a fierce determination. The assassin laughed, his body fluid and inhumanly fast as he attacked again. Hakon stepped forward, his axe swinging toward the assassin's back, but once again he slipped away like a shadow, leaving only the sound of his mocking laughter behind. "You'll have to do better than that," the assassin said, eyes gleaming with malice. Freydis was growing impatient, but she knew she had to stay focused. This fight wasn't just about power, it was about survival. The assassin moved faster than Freydis had anticipated. With each swipe of his blade, he pushed her back, his smirk never faltering. Sweat trickled down her forehead, and her breath grew shallow as the fight dragged on. She could feel herself tiring, but she refused to give up. "You think you're the only one who's lost everything?" she spat, her voice tight with rage. "I've lost my family, my home. I'll kill anyone who stands in my way." The assassin's eyes darkened for a moment, but then he chuckled, as though her words meant nothing. "You're nothing but a pawn," he said, his voice low and mocking. "Just like your father." Freydis froze. The mention of her father was like a slap to the face. The assassin had known her father? Or was he just trying to get into her head? But it was enough to fuel her anger. With a renewed burst of strength, she moved forward, catching the assassin off guard as she drove her dagger toward his chest. He blocked it with his own blade, but she could see the surprise in his eyes. "I'm not a pawn," she said, her voice steady, "and you'll soon learn that." Hakon, seeing an opportunity, swung his axe once more, this time catching the assassin off guard. The blade of his axe sliced through the assassin's cloak, grazing his side, and the assassin let out a low growl of frustration. For a split second, the assassin faltered, and Freydis seized the moment. With a roar, she lunged, her dagger aimed straight for the assassin's throat. But just as the blade was about to pierce his skin, the assassin vanished, disappearing into the shadows with an unnatural speed. "Damn it!" Freydis shouted, frustration seething in her chest. "Where did he go?" Hakon stood still, scanning the shadows. "He's gone," he said grimly. "But not for long. He'll be back." Freydis clenched her fists, her teeth gritted in anger. "I don't care how many times he runs," she said, her voice filled with fury. "Next time, we end it." She wasn't going to let this assassin escape again. Not when she was so close to finding the truth. Freydis and Hakon didn't have time to rest. The assassin had disappeared, but the battle wasn't over. They knew they had to find a way to get inside the fortress, and they couldn't afford any more delays. They approached the hidden entrance once again, moving as quietly as possible. Freydis' mind raced with 1,000 thoughts, each one more urgent than the last. The assassin's words had struck deep, and she couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this than just her father's death. The enemy had been planning something far larger, and she was only beginning to understand the true scope of their power. As they neared the entrance, Freydis stopped, her eyes narrowing. There was movement up ahead, more figures, cloaked and silent, creeping toward the entrance from another direction. Haakon cursed under his breath. "Looks like we've got company," he muttered. "Stay sharp." The two of them crouched, blending into the shadows, waiting for the right moment to strike. Without warning, the figures lunged at them, their movements swift and coordinated. Freydis reacted instantly, drawing her dagger and slashing at the nearest attacker. The clash of steel rang through the air as Haakon swung his axe with brutal precision, cutting down one of the figures before they could react. But there were too many of them, and their silent, fluid movements were almost as quick as the assassins. Freydis found herself surrounded, her breath coming in sharp gasps as she parried and countered, her muscles screaming with exhaustion. "We need to get inside," Haakon yelled over the noise of the battle. "Keep moving." But Freydis wasn't about to back down. She had come too far, and there was no turning back. With a final furious cry, she broke free from the group, carving a path through the attackers. "Get to the door," she shouted to Haakon, her eyes blazing with resolve. Together, they forced their way toward the entrance, the sound of battle fading behind them as they stepped into the fortress. The heavy wooden door creaked open, its ancient hinges groaning in protest as Freydis and Haakon slipped inside the fortress. The air was thick with dust, the silence almost suffocating. The walls around them were adorned with faded banners, the remnants of a once glorious past. The dim light from torches flickered against the stone walls, casting eerie shadows that seemed to follow their every move. "We're in," Freydis whispered, her voice barely audible. Haakon nodded, his eyes scanning the dark hall ahead. The tension between them was palpable, each step taken with the knowledge that they were deep within enemy territory now. The air felt colder as they moved deeper into the fortress, every creak of the floorboards beneath their feet amplified in the silence. Freydis' mind raced. This was the moment. The answers, the truth, lay just beyond these walls. But she could feel the weight of the unknown pressing down on her. "Stay alert," Haakon muttered, his voice low. "We don't know what's waiting for us." The deeper they ventured into the fortress, the more Freydis felt a strange sense of unease growing in her chest. It wasn't just the darkness or the silence, it was something else. The walls seemed to close in around them, the air thick with a presence that made her skin crawl. "This place is cursed," she muttered, more to herself than to Haakon. He didn't respond, but his tense posture confirmed that he too was feeling the weight of the fortress' oppressive atmosphere. They turned a corner, and Freydis froze. Ahead of them, a figure stood, cloaked in black, their back to them. It was the same assassin from before, the one who had taunted them, the one who had nearly killed them in the forest. The assassin turned slowly, his eyes glowing faintly in the dark. "Did you really think you could come here and leave alive?" he asked, his voice cold and filled with disdain. "You're too late. The ritual has already begun." Freydis' heart raced as she locked eyes with the assassin, her hand tightening around her dagger. Haakon stood beside her, his grip on his axe firm, but the assassin was already moving, his speed almost too quick to follow. In an instant he was upon them, his blade aimed for Freydis' throat. She barely managed to deflect it in time, the force of the blow pushing her back. "You've come to stop what's already set in motion," the assassin sneered, his voice dripping with contempt. "But you won't succeed." Freydis gritted her teeth, refusing to back down. "I won't let you destroy everything I've fought for," she spat, her dagger striking out toward him. The assassin parried easily, his movements fluid and lethal. Haakon swung his axe with brutal force, but once again, the assassin dodged, his laughter echoing through the hall. "You can't win," he taunted, "not against me." The battle raged on, each of them locked in a deadly dance, none willing to give an inch. With every blow, Freydis could feel herself growing more and more exhausted, the assassin's relentless attacks taking their toll. He was faster than she was, and no matter how many times she struck, she couldn't land a fatal blow. But she wasn't going to stop. Not now. With a sudden surge of adrenaline, she darted forward, her dagger aimed straight for the assassin's chest. This time, she was ready. Her strike was precise, cutting through the assassin's defenses. The assassin hissed in pain, his glowing eyes narrowing with fury. "You think you've won?" he spat, but Freydis didn't wait for him to recover. In one swift motion, she twisted her dagger, pulling it out and slashing across his throat. The assassin staggered back, clutching at the wound, but it was too late. With a final gurgling gasp, he crumpled to the ground, dead. Freydis stood over him, panting heavily, her body covered in sweat and blood. Hakon was by her side almost immediately, his face hard with determination. "Let's finish this," he said grimly. Freydis and Hakon made their way deeper into the fortress, their steps now more cautious, but their resolve stronger than ever. The assassin's death had been a victory, but it was only one small part of the larger battle. They still had to find the mastermind behind the chaos, the one who had orchestrated the destruction of her family and the unrest spreading throughout the lands. As they neared the heart of the fortress, Freydis could feel the temperature drop, the air growing colder with each step. The atmosphere seemed to shift, as if the very walls of the fortress were alive with dark energy. They reached a massive set of double doors, heavily fortified, adorned with symbols she didn't recognize. "This is it," Freydis said, her voice steady. "We finish it here." She looked at Hakon, who nodded, his face filled with grim determination. Together, they pushed open the doors, stepping into the final confrontation. The room beyond was dark, but Freydis could sense the presence of the one responsible. "Come out," she called into the darkness, her voice unwavering. "It's over."